So week one, we're going to be talking about the definition of atheism and why God's existence is self-evidently true. And we're also going to be talking about the concept of the fitrah in the Islamic tradition. I feel this is a very good place to start, because if we don't define what we mean by atheism, and we don't define what we mean by philosophical naturalism, because that's a very important concept that we're going to be referring to throughout the course, and we don't start with the right foot, if you like, we don't start with the right perspective, then it may skew our understanding of Islamic theism. Because it's very important for us to take the intellectual ground, if you like. It's very important for us, using a boxing analogy, not to be on the ropes. It's very important for us to be in the center of the ring. If you guys follow boxing or mixed martial arts, a good martial artist or a good boxer is one that takes the center of the ring. And from an intellectual, spiritual point of view, we need to take the center of the ring, to take control. And when we talk about the idea of God is self-evidently true, it is a way of taking the intellectual center of the ring, taking control. And I'm going to explain more what I mean by that as we go on today, inshallah. Now, when we talk about the self-evident truth of God's existence, this doesn't mean that we reject arguments for God's existence. It doesn't mean there are no good arguments for God's existence. Of course there are. And we're going to be talking about them throughout this course, inshallah. But it's very important to start with the concept of God's self-evident reality, because it allows us to take the center of the intellectual and spiritual room, inshallah. And as I said previously, it's very important to start with definitions, because we need to understand, what do we mean by atheism, right? And from a practical point of view, what do we mean by atheism? And what are some of the philosophical ideas that may be connected to atheism or imply atheism? For example, philosophical naturalism is going to be this idea that we're going to be talking about a lot, because most atheists, practically speaking, not all of them, but most of them are actually philosophical naturalists. So we need to understand, what does that mean? What does it entail? What does it imply? How does that challenge the Islamic worldview? How can we defend the Islamic worldview against philosophical naturalism, and how can we basically show that philosophical naturalism is incoherent? So before I get into the rest of the day, let's quickly talk about what we're going to be dealing with in this course. So week number one, we're going to be talking about the definition of atheism and why God's existence is self-evidently true, which is today, inshallah. Week number two, we're going to be talking about the implications of life without Allah. What are the existential implications? What does that mean? Existential means referring to the self, to your own experience, to your own lived experience. This is also connected to the idea of phenomenology. So it's the experience of experience, right? So without God, what is this life about? How can we make sense of this life from an experiential point of view? Can we make sense of the idea of purpose, ultimate purpose? Can we have meaningful happiness? Can we have, for example, ultimate value for human existence, and so on and so forth? Week number three, we're going to be talking about the argument from contingency, also known as the argument from dependency. I love this argument. I think this is the best argument for God's existence, because in the schools of Aqidah, in the schools of creed, in the Islamic tradition, they all refer to this argument. And it's a powerful argument because it's based on metaphysical first principles. It's not based on something that is ever-changing like science. It actually transcends science. The beautiful thing about this particular argument is, no matter what scientific evidence you have in the 21st century or even the 31st century, it's not going to affect the efficacy of this argument. Week number four, we're going to be talking about the Quranic argument for God's existence, the Quran's argument for God. We're going to be doing a tadabbur, a pondering, a reflection, an inference from the verses in chapter 52, verses 35 to 36, when Allah says, did you come from nothing? Did you create yourself? Did you create the heavens and the earth? بَلْ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. Indeed, you have no certainty. Week number 5, we're going to be going through an argument from consciousness, and we're going to talk about the hard problem of consciousness and how that is a problem for atheism, it's a problem for philosophical naturalism, and that it makes sense of theism, or at least a form of integrated theistic dualism. Don't worry about the big words, we're going to explain them all inshallah, okay? Week number 6, another really powerful argument for God's existence, which is about objective morality. If you believe some moral values and properties are mind independent, meaning that they're true even if the whole world were to deny them. For example, if you believe that the killing of 6 million Jews is objectively evil, and you know it's objective to the degree that even if the whole world were to come and say that no, in actual fact it's good, you know it's still evil. So if you know objective morals and properties, moral values and properties are mind independent from that perspective, that they exist in the real world in some way, then objective morality can only be explained by the existence of God. Week number 7, we're going to be talking about Islam's response to the problem of evil and suffering. How do we respond to the evidential argument concerning the problem of evil, the logical form of the argument? What does Islam say? What does the Quran say? We're going to do tadabbur of chapter 18 of the Quran and other aspects of the Quran, for example, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 30, and so on and so forth, to show how the problem of evil and suffering is actually not a problem at all. It's actually a problem for the philosophical naturalist. It's a problem for the atheist. Week number 8, we're going to be talking about, does science undermine God and his revelation? So we're going to show that actually science doesn't undermine God, and it doesn't actually undermine the Quran or the concept of revelation in any shape or form. And we're going to give you some concepts from the philosophy of science and from other domains of knowledge to empower you to understand that. Week number 9, the most important question, the most important part of the course, which is, why is God worthy of worship? Right? Why is God worthy of worship? And the reason this is the most important question, because as you all know, or inshallah you should know, that the raison d'etre, right? Excuse my French. The reason for existence of human beings, of the spirit world, the jinn, is really to worship Allah. What does worshipping Allah mean? It means to know Allah, to love Allah, to obey Allah, and to direct and single out all acts of worship to Allah alone. This is what worship means. And this is extremely, extremely powerful. And we have to understand that the whole point of the Quran, the reason the Quran was sent down, is to remind humanity and inform humanity of that fact. To inform humanity that there is no deity worthy of worship. There is no deity worthy of worship. And worship really entails that you know Allah, that you love Allah, that you obey Allah, and that you direct and single out all acts of worship to Allah alone, the internal acts of worship and the external acts of worship. And all of our arguments, every single one of the arguments, the argument from consciousness, the argument from contingency, the Quran's argument for God's existence, the argument from morality, all of these arguments are going to be linked to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if we don't link our arguments, if we don't link these powerful ideas, these powerful evidences for the existence of God, if we don't link them to the fact that Allah is worthy of worship, then we're doing a disservice to Islam. We're doing a disservice to the Quran. We're doing a disservice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because really, if you really reflect on the Quran, the main question the Quran tries to answer is, who is worthy of worship? That's the main question. And you're going to understand in week number 9 that really the default position for every single human being is to worship something, even if they deny God. Because worship entails that you love something the most, that you know something the most, you refer to or obey something the most, and that you direct acts of worship like ultimate gratitude towards something the most. If that thing is not God, it's going to be something else. It's going to be your ego, it's going to be other people, it's going to be celebrity culture. And that's why your default position as a human being, whether you're an atheist or not, whether you're a believer or not, is to worship something by definition. And that's why, the Islamic thinker Martin Lings He said, man cannot not worship. Allahu Akbar. Yeah. So we're going to expand on that. We're going to expand on the verse in the Quran, chapter 39, verse 29, when Allah talks to us and says that, I'm paraphrasing, consider the situation of two people. One man is a slave, is a servant to many masters, and they're all quarreling, but another slave, another servant is a servant to one master. Whose condition is best? It's as if Allah is saying to us that if you don't worship Allah, you're going to be worshipping many other deities, if you like, and they don't know what's good for you. They don't know what's good for you. What's good for you. Allah is the one who loves you and has more affection for you than your mother. Then week number 10, we're going to be answering popular and academic objections. So, inshallah, let's now talk about today, week 1. We're going to be talking about the definition of atheism. We're going to be talking about misotheism, which is really something that is lurking in the dark. Miso means hatred in Greek. Theism comes from the Greek word theos, which means God. So basically, it's the hatred of God. And we're going to explain what that means and how it relates to our discussion. We're going to be talking about philosophical naturalism and how it relates to today's discussion as well. We're going to expand on the Islamic definition for atheism as well. And we're going to be talking about the idea that the existence of a creator, the underlying concept of a creator, not necessarily God with names and attributes, but the very essential idea of a creator is actually self-evidently true. And we're going to take the intellectual ground, the center of the intellectual ring, and we're going to show that actually the one who told us the burden of proof is the atheist, not the theist. This doesn't mean we don't have arguments for God's existence. Of course we do. But based on the idea of self-evident truths, which is an idea that exists in many domains of knowledge, and is an idea that atheists and theists would agree with, that based on that the atheist is actually the one that is on the ropes, if you like, just to use another boxing analogy from that perspective. So, let's start with the definition of atheism. So, let's go to the language. So, atheism basically is a Greek word. So, theos means God, and theism is basically referring to God, and the is a negation. So, from a linguistic point of view, atheism is really someone who's not atheist, someone who doesn't believe in a God or gods. It's simple as that, okay? But this is from a linguistic point of view. However, from an academic point of view, from what I've read so far, there is no consensus for a specific definition of atheism. And I think sometimes it's almost pointless to try and pin down a specific definition of atheism, okay? Because generally speaking, especially in a cultural perspective, you have atheists, and many atheists, they basically say that, oh, it's not a belief, it's just an absence of a belief. And they don't really like any labels. And I think if you focus on the definition from a psychological point of view, they'll put their barriers up. I think it's best to be practical about this, and when we have conversations in a practical manner, then you start to understand that every atheist is an individual. Like, we don't otherize atheists. We don't think they're all the same and they're all bad, for example. That is not part of the Islamic tradition. When you study holistically the Quran and the Sunnah, you will see that when it comes to engagement with other people, that you treat them as individuals. Yes, there are groups mentioned in the Quran, there are categories mentioned in the Quran in a general way for us to reflect upon, to see if individually, if we are part of those groups, they could agitate us to actually transform ourselves and change. It's not necessarily there to use, basically superimpose those categories on individuals when we're trying to engage with them. We treat them as individuals. And we understand this from the Quran itself in the 3rd chapter, when Allah says, people are not the same. People are not the same. And when we look at the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his engagement with individuals was based on their individual context. So there were variables concerning someone's context, be moral variables, social variables, cultural variables, and those variables and even psychological variables, they were considered. Those variables were considered in a very significant way in order to be able to engage with the individual in a profound way. It's very important that we don't otherize human beings. We don't otherize them. We don't say a human being that belongs to a particular group, they're the same as every member of that group and they're all negative. This is not part of the Islamic tradition. In actual fact, as a default position, we need to really understand, as a default position, we really need to understand that the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, a prophetic tradition that is authentic, and this was narrated by Bukhari, and it is in Tarikh al-Kabir. It is authentic hadith, it is sahih. The Prophet ﷺ said, love for linnas, what you love for yourself. Which means love for humanity, what you love for yourself. Okay? So the Arabic here is linnas, for the people, love for humanity, what you love for yourself, inshallah. So, this is why it's important to start to talk about the practical realities of atheists, and not to stick to just one particular academic definition, which really, in my view, doesn't really exist. So, from a practical point of view, brothers and sisters, let's now talk about the practical definitions on what it means to be an atheist from that perspective. So, the first thing to appreciate, brothers and sisters, is the first type of practical of being an atheist. That some atheists may consider themselves as people who have an argument against God's existence. So they would basically say that, well, I don't believe in God. I reject the belief in God. Because I have an argument against God. So from this perspective, you could understand atheism as a knowledge claim. They would say there is no God because I have an argument against the existence. Atheism from this perspective, a positive assertion. It would be a positive assertion, and it provides some kind of argument and evidence to support that assertion. So practically speaking, atheists from this perspective would be those who basically argue against the existence of God, and they argue from the point of view that they have some kind of knowledge, they have some kind of argument against his existence. And this is very important to understand. Now, by the way, when you understand these different practical categories of atheists, they're not binary and exclusive, meaning if someone's an atheist and believes that they have a positive knowledge claim, they have a positive argument against God, this doesn't necessarily mean now that they can't also be an atheist because of the other categories that we're going to be talking about. So they're not binary, they're not exclusive, and they could be to different varying levels of each category. Okay, so that's something important to also understand. So the next kind of practical category, what it means to be an atheist, is that an atheist is not really convinced by any theistic arguments. So this atheist is not convinced by any theistic arguments. I remember, as I said, these are not exclusive categories. an atheist can believe that they have a positive argument against God's existence, they have a knowledge claim, and at the same time, they could be not convinced by any theistic arguments as well. So this category is someone who is not convinced by any theistic arguments. So they're basically saying, look, all of the arguments for God's existence, or all the so-called evidence that you're providing me, it's not adequate evidence. It's not good evidence. And I'm not convinced by these arguments. So therefore, really, if you think about this, they really consider atheism to be the default position. And they really believe that in order to believe in God, you need some positive knowledge, in terms of you need a positive argument. Now, from this context, this type of atheist is not really an atheist from the point of view that they do not believe in God, but rather, in my view, it's entering into the realm of agnosticism. So they become agnostics, okay? Because they're basically saying, look, you make a claim that God exists, you're providing me with arguments, but I'm just not currently convinced. So what does this mean? This assumes, or this position, in my view, really implies that if someone were to provide a good argument for God's existence, they would have to accept it. Because what does an agnostic do? An agnostic is agnostic because they're not convinced. That's the point here. They're not convinced. Now, the reason they may say they don't believe in God is because they believe that's the default position. Okay? But given the fact that this type of atheist is the one who's not convinced by any arguments for God's existence, then it implies that if we could provide a good argument, then they would have to accept it. So this really is an agnostic type of atheism. And to be honest, I think most atheists are not really atheists from the point of view that they have an argument against God per se, but really, I think most of their atheism is motivated by some form of agnosticism. They're agnostic. They're not really convinced about God's existence because maybe they haven't seen any compelling arguments or any compelling ideas to support the idea of God's existence, so therefore they believe the default position is not to believe in Him. The third and final category of what it means practically to be an atheist, and just to remind you again, these are not binary categories. These are not binary categories. They're not exclusive. An atheist could be all three to different levels. So another type of atheist is what I call lifestyle atheism. Now, if an atheist disbelieves based on mere choice, by the way, in the absence of any rational investigation, then, how does that differ from any other belief, whether it's a belief in fairies or astrology? Now, you may be thinking, well, really, are really atheists just atheists because they just adopt it as a lifestyle? They don't like the idea of religion. They don't like the idea of a god, of a divine king and a divine master over their lives. They don't like the idea. They just from a lifestyle point of view, just want to join the kind of bandwagon, if you like. Some atheists are like that. Unfortunately, especially in the Muslim world. Like from my experience, I went to Pakistan twice, and I went to the private universities there. I went to LUMS, which is like the Oxford of Pakistan. And really, you had some of the Muslims there, or so-called Muslims there, basically promoting a type of atheistic philosophy, and they had no clue what they were talking about, some of them. They just suffered from some kind of social pressure, because if you really think about it, if you study social psychology, you see that human beings, they have a need to belong and they have a need to feel certain. Now, this is based on two key ideas in social psychology, which is the development of the social norm. One key idea is that it refers to something called informational social influence, and the other key idea is normative social influence. Now, informational social influence, brothers and sisters and friends, is basically based on our need to feel certain. So if we don't feel certain about something, and we can't get that certainty from our immediate group, we will go to another dominant group or another group in order to find that certainty. So, for example, if someone at university cannot find certainty of their belief within the Muslim community in some way, they're going to go to another group, maybe to the secular people or to the atheists, in order to try and find that certainty. The other key idea, as we mentioned, is normative social influence, which is based on basically our need to belong. Every human being has a need to belong. No one really wants to be lonely. And if you read the book of Mice and Men by Steinbeck, that book is all about really loneliness. You'd rather have a friend that is a liability than be lonely, right? That's the main theme of that story. And this is so true. People don't want to be lonely. People want to express themselves. People want to belong. Even one of my favorite Greek authors, Antonis Samarakis, he wrote a book called Zidite Elpis, which means hope wanted. It's a series of short stories, which is phenomenally written short stories. And one of my favorite short stories is called Mia Nichta, One Night. And this story is about a man who's working in an office, and he has a real need to express himself. He seems to be very, very lonely. And, I can't tell you the whole story now, but to cut a long story short, after failing to try and express himself and connect with another human being, he ends up expressing himself to a shadow in the dark. And after a few hours, he realizes that he was really expressing himself to a snowman. It's a really sad story, but we don't have time for it. But the point is, human beings have a need to belong. Given the fact that human beings have a need to belong, if for example, Muslim student doesn't feel belonging, to the immediate Muslim community, maybe because they don't understand him or her, or maybe because they're a bit harsh, or maybe because they're not compassionate enough, or maybe because they're afraid to answer their questions, or whatever the case may be, they will go to the dominant group or to another group, even if they disagree with the ideas of that group. They might go to that group because it will give them a sense of belonging. Because if for example, a Muslim or a Muslim student doesn't feel that sense of belonging, because there is, for example, some kind of cultural chasm between themselves and their parents or the cultural community that happen to be Muslim, they're going to not feel that belonging because maybe they're a bit judgmental, because people have un-Islamic practices and ideas, because sometimes the Muslim community can unfortunately be like that. They won't find that sense of belonging. If they go to the mosque and trying to connect with the community there, but they reject him because, I don't know, he may have some quirky ideas and he may look a bit different, and he's trying to find his balance and himself and his identity. If he gets chucked out of the masjid or the mosque and gets rejected, well, there you go. We reap what we sow. And this person would try and find that belonging elsewhere. And that's what happens. So this is very similar to someone who adopts atheism just as a lifestyle. I know this for sure, because you interact with people like this. They don't even know why they're atheists. And even so-called professionals. I remember the Australian Atheist Conference. I think it was held quite a few years ago now. There was a lady who just said, I'm an atheist because I just choose to be, right? No arguments, no conviction. It was basically maybe just a reaction to what she felt religion provides for her, and she felt what religion provides is something backward and something that I don't want. But I don't have an argument against religion or have an argument against God. I'm just going to be an atheist because I just want to be an atheist. Atheist is a lifestyle thing. So if you understand atheism from these kind of categories and understand that they're not binary, they're not exclusive, an atheist could be all three or two of them, and to different leveling degrees, and they could be motivated by each aspect of each aspect of atheism in a different way or a different level, then it will give you the tools to be able to engage with people and not to stick to one particular definition, but to listen with the intention to understand, to find out, okay, what is motivating this person? What's going on here? And that would help you to be able to sincerely strategize to engage with them in a way that affects them in the most profound way. For example, if someone's the type of atheist that they have a positive claim against God's existence, and they're really adamant on that, and you know that that's the case for sure, then what you need to do is actually respond to that particular argument. Now, if the main motivation for that particular atheist is that they could sit within the category of being an agnostic, that they don't have good arguments, or they believe that there are no good arguments for God's existence, then what you need to do is provide a good argument for God's existence. And at the same time, because if you remember, an agnostic type of atheist from what we just discussed assumes atheism is the default position, then what you need to do is to use today's webinar to show to them that actually atheism is not the default position. It's actually theism, which we're going to discuss in a short while, inshallah. Also, the lifestyle atheist, if they're just an atheist because of lifestyle, then maybe what you need to do is engage with that person with good akhlaq, good behavior, be compassionate, show to them how religion affects their lives in a positive way, in a profound way, give them a sense of belonging, give them a sense of certainty, and all of these other things that we spoke about.